SUA. Is this your final decision? Daniel Brooks asked, smoothing the cuff of his faded blue shirt before slipping the small leather notebook into the front pocket of his jacket. Monica Hale did not bother looking up from the termination letter resting on the polished conference table. It is, she replied. Human Resources has already processed everything. Daniel gave a single nod, lifted the plain cardboard box waiting beside his chair, and walked out without another word. The open office floor fell unusually quiet for 2 seconds before scattered whispers began chasing him toward the elevators. Someone laughed behind a row of computer monitors. Someone else muttered that the quiet ones always broke eventually. Daniel never turned around. He adjusted the strap of the worn messenger bag resting across his shoulder, balanced the cardboard box against one hip, and pressed the elevator button with the same careful hand that had spent years checking shipment reports line by line. Inside the box sat little more than a coffee mug with a faded mountain design, a phone charger wound into a perfect circle, 2 framed drawings made with colored pencils, and an empty lunch container washed so clean it still smelled faintly of lemon soap. When the elevator doors opened into the marble lobby, the receptionist glanced at him, hesitated, then lowered her eyes to her keyboard. Outside, the summer air carried the distant sound of ambulance sirens weaving through downtown traffic toward another hospital waiting on another delayed shipment. Daniel stepped onto the front plaza and set the cardboard box on a concrete bench. He removed the leather notebook, flipped through several pages filled with tidy handwriting and carefully marked dates, then closed it again. His phone came out next. He scrolled past family photos until he reached a single saved contact. The call connected before the second ring. "This is Daniel Brooks," he said evenly. "The termination has been completed exactly as documented." A brief pause followed. He listened without interrupting, his free hand unconsciously straightening the edge of the notebook against the box. "Yes," he answered. "It is time. Remove every one of them from active authority before another report disappears." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket as if he had just confirmed an ordinary delivery. Across the glass entrance, Monica watched from the executive lobby with folded arms, wearing the calm expression of someone convinced a problem had finally been eliminated. Several managers gathered beside her, smiling with the comfortable confidence of people who believe the afternoon belonged to them. None of them noticed the black sedan turning slowly into the underground executive entrance. None of them noticed security officers quietly receiving messages through their earpieces. Daniel picked up the cardboard box once more and walked toward the parking garage instead of the employee lot. His steps never changed pace. Before reaching the crosswalk, his phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen, but did not answer. The caller ID displayed only one word: bored. He silenced the call, opened the back door of his aging pickup truck, and carefully placed the cardboard box beside a bright purple backpack decorated with tiny silver stars. A folded hospital appointment reminder rested beneath the backpack strap, exactly where he had left it that morning. Daniel looked at it for one silent moment, closed the truck door gently enough that the drawings inside the box would not bend, and drove away while the people inside the building continued celebrating the end of a story they did not yet realize had only just begun. SUA 3 weeks earlier, Daniel Brooks parked his aging pickup in the employee lot before sunrise, choosing the same space near the far fence where nobody competed for shade later in the afternoon. He arrived 40 minutes early every morning, not because anyone expected it, but because quiet buildings revealed details noisy ones buried. Inside the distribution headquarters, he filled a plain ceramic mug with black coffee, added nothing to it, and walked through the operations floor before most desks were occupied. Burned-out monitor lights, overflowing recycling bins, shipping manifests left unsecured, and boxes stacked a little too close to emergency exits all found their way into the small leather notebook he carried everywhere. He never announced what he wrote. He simply closed the notebook, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and greeted the first warehouse associate by name. By 8 o'clock, the building had transformed into a maze of ringing phones, rolling carts, and hurried conversations about inventory moving toward hospitals across 4 states. Daniel settled into his workstation without decorating it beyond two framed drawings taped beside the monitor. One showed a crooked blue pickup beneath an enormous yellow sun. The other showed a girl and her father standing beside a lake with fishing poles much taller than either of them. When Grace Nolan walked past carrying two overfilled folders, Daniel stood before she reached his desk and quietly took the heavier stack without asking. She thanked him with a tired smile and hurried toward the compliance office. Daniel returned to his chair, adjusted the cuff of his shirt out of habit, and began comparing shipment records line by line against supplier confirmations. Around him, conversations rose and fell like machinery. Nobody noticed him until somebody needed an answer. The work itself was repetitive, but Daniel treated every document as though a single overlooked number could eventually land in the wrong hospital at the wrong hour. Shortly before lunch, his phone vibrated once. Olivia's name appeared across the screen beside a picture of her grinning beneath a baseball cap several sizes too large. Daniel stepped into an empty hallway before answering. Olivia did not waste words. She told him her science quiz had gone well, reminded him not to forget the appointment with the orthopedic surgeon the following Tuesday, then asked whether he had remembered to eat breakfast instead of pretending coffee counted. Daniel smiled without making a sound, promised he had eaten, and listened while she explained that she had reorganized the kitchen pantry after school because the canned soup had been stacked too high. Before hanging up, she reminded him to drive carefully because the brakes still squeaked whenever it rained. Daniel slipped the phone away and stared for one quiet moment through the narrow hallway window before returning to his desk. That afternoon, a supervisor praised a weekly inventory report during the department meeting. Daniel recognized every correction on the pages projected across the conference room wall because he had finished them after everyone else left the previous evening. Monica Hale thanked another manager for the excellent work. The room applauded politely. Daniel lowered his eyes, turned one page in his notebook, and wrote a single date beside the project number before closing the cover. Nobody noticed. Near the end of the day, Grace approached his desk carrying a sealed folder. She spoke softly enough that nearby conversations swallowed most of her words. Several supplier totals inside the monthly compliance package did not match archived records, and she could not explain why. Daniel accepted the folder without opening it immediately. Instead, he looked toward the executive offices where Monica's door remained closed, then placed the folder beneath his notebook rather than inside the shared filing tray. As employees packed their bags, laughter drifted toward the elevators while cleaning crews began replacing trash liners one office at a time. Daniel stayed behind another 20 minutes comparing figures that should have matched but did not. Outside, rain began tapping steadily against the windows. He finally closed the folder, drew a careful line beneath the last handwritten note, and circled one shipment number that appeared twice under different destinations, 41,587. SUA by the following Monday, the operations floor had settled back into its familiar rhythm, one where efficiency mattered less than appearances and everyone seemed to understand invisible rules that had never been written down. Monica Hale arrived exactly at 8:15 carrying a leather portfolio that nobody else was allowed to touch. She crossed the department without greeting anyone, paused only long enough to straighten a crooked presentation board near the conference room, then disappeared into her office behind a glass wall overlooking the entire floor. From there she watched people the way some managers watch numbers, measuring posture, confidence, hesitation, and loyalty before performance ever entered the equation. Derek Lawson, the regional operations manager assigned to oversee several compliance teams, spent considerably less time working than he did making certain other people saw him working. Every successful presentation somehow included his name. Every delayed shipment somehow found another owner. When executives toured the building, Derek always seemed to be standing beside the newest accomplishment, smiling just long enough for photographs before moving on to the next conversation. Daniel remained at his workstation through most of it, comparing invoices, supplier certifications, and transportation logs with the same patient rhythm he used every day. Every hour or so he reached into his pocket, opened the worn leather notebook, wrote several careful lines, then closed it again without looking around to see whether anyone had noticed. During the afternoon compliance meeting, Derek projected a revised performance dashboard onto the conference room screen and accepted congratulations for reducing reporting errors across the division. Daniel quietly recognized several charts that had originated from spreadsheets he completed the previous Friday. He folded one sleeve another half-inch, rested both hands on the table, and listened without interrupting. When Monica asked whether anyone had concerns, silence settled over the room. Daniel glanced once toward Grace Nolan, who lowered her eyes to her notebook before anyone else noticed. Monica accepted the silence as agreement and moved to the next agenda item. Later that day, Grace appeared beside Daniel's desk carrying another stack of archived shipping records. She did not sit down. "These supplier confirmations disappeared from the shared drive," she said softly. "I found printed copies in storage." Daniel accepted the folder, thanked her, and placed it beneath the notebook already resting beside his keyboard instead of opening it immediately. Across the room, Derek happened to glance in their direction. Grace walked away almost at once, but Daniel remained exactly where he was, calmly returning to the report on his monitor. Derek frowned for only a second before continuing toward Monica's office. "He keeps writing everything down," Derek remarked after closing the glass door behind him. Monica continued reviewing quarterly projections without lifting her head. "Some people enjoy paperwork," she answered. "Or they enjoy making themselves look indispensable." Derek leaned against the conference table. "Grace keeps bringing him old files. More than usual." Monica finally looked through the glass wall toward the operations floor where Daniel was helping a warehouse coordinator correct shipping labels after hours even though the task belonged to another department. Daniel thanked the coordinator, collected the rejected labels into neat stacks, wiped a coffee ring from the edge of the shared workstation with a paper towel, and returned the marker someone else had left uncapped. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. Nothing suggested ambition. "Does he complain?" Monica asked. "No." "Does he argue?" "Never." "Then let him organize paper until he gets bored." She closed the portfolio with quiet finality. "People like Daniel eventually make one mistake because they believe effort matters more than authority." Derek nodded, apparently satisfied, yet his eyes drifted once more toward the operations floor. Daniel had just paused beside the warehouse exit to greet a forklift driver by name before stepping outside to answer a brief phone call. He spoke for less than 30 seconds, listened more than he talked, then returned carrying the same calm expression he wore every morning. Derek could not explain why that unsettled him. The call itself meant nothing. The notebook meant nothing. Grace bringing old records probably meant nothing as well. Separately, each detail looked ordinary. Together, they refused to settle comfortably in the back of his mind. Even so, Monica dismissed every concern with a wave of her hand. Before leaving for the evening, she instructed Derek and Victor Lang from Human Resources to conduct a complete performance review of Daniel Brooks, beginning with every compliance report he had handled during the past 6 months, convinced the audit would finally produce the justification needed to remove the quiet employee who, in her opinion, had begun asking far too few questions and noticing far too much. SUA The orthopedic appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday afternoon, and Daniel had already arranged to leave the office an hour early so he could drive Olivia across town without making her miss another week of school. That morning began like every other. He parked beneath the same fading light pole, carried the same worn messenger bag through the employee entrance, poured the same black coffee into the chipped mountain mug, and walked one slow circuit across the operations floor before sitting down. A shipping coordinator stopped him beside the loading schedule board to ask about an inventory discrepancy involving cardiac monitors bound for 3 regional hospitals. Daniel accepted the paperwork, thanked the coordinator, and quietly compared the serial numbers against supplier confirmations. One shipment appeared twice under separate destinations, exactly like the number he had circled in his notebook several days earlier. Instead of forwarding the documents immediately, he walked to the records archive, retrieved the printed supplier certifications Grace had recovered from storage, and spread every page across an unused conference table. The timestamps did not align. Approval signatures had been copied onto reports completed before the inventory physically arrived. Purchase quantities changed between archived copies and digital records. More troubling than the numbers themselves was the pattern. Every altered report passed through the same management chain before reaching executive review. Daniel closed his eyes for one brief second, gathered the documents into precise stacks, and placed colored tabs along the margins. At noon, Monica summoned department supervisors into the executive conference room to review quarterly performance metrics. Daniel attended because compliance documentation formed part of the presentation package, although nobody expected him to speak. Derek moved confidently through polished slides praising improved efficiency and record accuracy while colorful graphs climbed upward across the screen. Daniel watched without expression until one chart displayed the altered shipment totals he had just verified against the archived files. He waited for the presentation to end. When Monica asked whether anyone required clarification before the reports were submitted to the executive committee, Daniel raised his hand for the first time since joining the department. Every conversation in the room faded almost instantly. Monica looked mildly surprised but nodded. Daniel stood, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and placed one printed document beside the projector. The supplier certifications supporting these inventory totals do not match the archived compliance records, he said evenly. I cannot verify the accuracy of this submission. Nobody answered for several long seconds. Derek leaned forward first. Those documents were updated after vendor corrections. Daniel looked toward him without raising his voice. Then the archived approval dates should also have changed. Derek reached for the paperwork, scanned the first page, and pushed it aside. You are comparing outdated files. Daniel placed 2 additional copies beside the first. These were printed from secure storage yesterday. The approval signatures appear before the inventory arrival dates. Monica folded her hands on the conference table. Are you refusing to certify this report? Daniel met her eyes without hesitation. I cannot sign information that I cannot verify. The room remained silent enough for someone outside the conference room to be heard dropping a binder onto the hallway floor. Victor Lang shifted uneasily in his chair but said nothing. Grace stared at the documents in front of her without lifting her head. Monica gathered every printed page into a single stack, tapped the edges square against the table, and slid them toward herself. Very well, she said. We will review your concerns internally. Daniel gave one short nod, returned to his seat, and wrote a single line inside the leather notebook before closing it again. The meeting adjourned less than 5 minutes later. Employees filed quietly back toward their desks, avoiding eye contact as they passed him. By late afternoon, Daniel discovered that his access to several compliance databases had been temporarily restricted pending what information technology described as a routine permissions review. Grace attempted to send him 2 archived files, but the transfer failed before reaching his inbox. When Daniel gathered his belongings to leave for Olivia's appointment, his employee badge refused access to the secure records room where he had worked every day since arriving. He studied the red warning light for a moment, slipped the badge back into his wallet without complaint, and continued toward the parking lot while, behind the glass walls of the executive offices, Monica instructed Victor and Derek to begin formal disciplinary proceedings against Daniel Brooks before the disputed reports could leave the building, unsigned. As usual the next morning, Daniel arrived at work carrying the same worn messenger bag and the same chipped coffee mug, but his employee badge no longer opened the compliance office. A temporary access notice appeared on the security screen before the door clicked shut again. He stepped aside without arguing, thanked the security officer who looked more uncomfortable than confident, and carried his laptop to an empty workstation near the warehouse dispatch area. Around him, conversations slowed for only a moment before returning to their usual rhythm, though several people glanced toward him more often than they had the day before. Grace walked past with a stack of reports held tightly against her chest. She hesitated just long enough to leave a folded sticky note beneath Daniel's notebook before continuing down the aisle without turning around. Daniel waited until she disappeared into another department before opening it. The note contained only one sentence. They are reviewing every file connected to your name. He folded the paper once, placed it inside the leather notebook, and returned to comparing transportation logs that nobody had yet removed from his limited system access. Shortly before noon, Victor Lang appeared beside his desk accompanied by a human resources assistant carrying a tablet. Victor spoke in the measured tone he reserved for difficult conversations he preferred not to own. Daniel was instructed to attend a formal performance review immediately. Inside the conference room, Monica already sat at the far end of the polished table, while Derek organized several printed reports into careful stacks. One by one, they presented delayed shipments, disputed documentation, missed deadlines, and complaints that Daniel had never seen before. Each accusation sounded complete when read alone. Together they painted the picture of an employee who questioned authority, disrupted workflow, and created unnecessary administrative delays. Daniel requested copies of the supporting records before responding. Victor informed him they would become available after the review concluded. Monica asked whether he intended to withdraw his objections regarding the compliance reports. Daniel rested both hands on the table, straightened the cuff of his shirt almost absent-mindedly, and answered with the same steady voice he had used throughout every meeting since arriving at the company. "No." Derek leaned forward. "Your refusal has already delayed executive reporting." Daniel looked toward the stack of documents in front of him. "Submitting inaccurate information would delay far more than a report." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Monica finally slid a prepared letter across the table. Administrative leave without pay would begin immediately while an internal investigation reviewed his conduct. His company laptop, identification badge, remote access credentials, and compliance authority were revoked effective at once. Daniel read every page carefully instead of signing immediately. When he reached the final paragraph, he quietly removed a pen from his pocket, signed where required, and placed the document back on the table without adding a single unnecessary word. He gathered the leather notebook before anyone else could reach for it, lifted the worn messenger bag onto his shoulder, and walked out carrying little more than the belongings he had brought on his first day. Outside the building, rain tapped softly across the windshield of his pickup while he sat motionless for several minutes. His phone vibrated with a reminder for Olivia's surgery consultation scheduled the following week, followed almost immediately by a message from the insurance provider confirming that employment verification would soon determine continued medical coverage. Daniel closed the notification, started the truck, and drove directly to the clinic instead of home. Olivia met him in the waiting room holding a thick library book against her chest. She noticed the messenger bag before anything else. "Did you finish early?" she asked. Daniel smiled gently, took the backpack from her shoulder, and nodded once. "Something changed at work." She studied his face for a long moment, then quietly slipped the envelope containing her birthday savings into his jacket pocket without saying why. Daniel rested one hand over hers, returned the envelope to her backpack before she could protest, and walked beside her into the examination room while the unanswered questions followed them both like a shadow, and the company prepared the final document that would erase his career. The termination letter arrived 2 days later by certified mail. Daniel signed for the envelope, thanked the postal carrier, and placed it unopened beside the coffee mug on his small kitchen table, while Olivia finished her homework at the opposite end. She glanced toward the envelope once, then quietly reached for the grocery receipt instead. "We still have enough for the week," she said after adding the numbers twice with careful pencil marks. Daniel nodded, opened the refrigerator, and rearranged the shelves without taking anything out, placing tomorrow's lunch containers beside each other before closing the door again. The next morning, he drove Olivia to school, waited until she disappeared through the front entrance, and spent the next several hours inside the public library instead of sitting at home. He requested public transportation records, regulatory filing requirements, and archived procurement guidelines, filling page after page inside the same worn leather notebook that had followed him through every day inside the company. He never rushed. Every note carried a date, a source, and a page reference. Shortly after noon, his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. Grace spoke so quietly he almost mistook the connection for static. "They are deleting archived folders," she whispered. Not everything. Only the files connected to the compliance review. Daniel remained silent long enough for her to continue on her own. Someone from information technology came with human resources. They removed entire directories. Daniel looked across the library toward rows of students studying for exams. Do not copy anything, he said evenly. Do not send me anything. Keep doing your job. Grace hesitated. What if they ask about you? Daniel closed the notebook and rested one hand across the cover. Tell the truth if someone asks. Nothing more. The call ended without another word. Hundreds of miles of supply routes stretched across the map lying open before him, but Daniel's eyes remained fixed on a single handwritten shipment number he had copied days earlier from the printed records Grace recovered from storage. That evening, Monica convened a management meeting behind the closed glass walls of the executive conference room. Derek reported that Daniel's system credentials had been permanently disabled, his workstation reassigned, and every active project transferred to other managers. Victor confirmed the termination paperwork had been finalized and forwarded to payroll. Monica listened without interruption before asking one question. Has anyone found evidence supporting his accusations? Derek shook his head immediately. Nothing credible. Victor answered more cautiously. Most of the archived files are no longer accessible. Monica accepted the response with a slight nod and instructed everyone to move forward. By next week, she said, this will be finished. Across the operations floor, however, the atmosphere had begun shifting in quieter ways. Employees lowered their voices whenever shipment reports were discussed. Grace noticed warehouse supervisors making photocopies before submitting inventory forms. A dispatcher who had never spoken to Daniel before quietly began keeping duplicate delivery logs inside his own desk drawer. Nobody announced these changes. Nobody challenged management openly. Yet small habits spread from desk to desk with surprising speed, as though one unanswered question had taught people to preserve what they previously discarded. Late Friday afternoon, an information technology specialist named Marcus entered the records server room to complete routine storage maintenance. While verifying deletion logs, he noticed something that should not have existed. Hundreds of digital compliance files had disappeared, yet every deletion request referenced reports that no longer appeared anywhere in the active database. Even stranger, the authorization trail stopped halfway through the approval chain, leaving blank spaces where executive verification should have been recorded. Marcus frowned, printed the audit summary, folded it once, and slipped it into his jacket instead of leaving it in the system queue. He did not know what the missing records meant. He only knew that databases rarely erase themselves so neatly. Before leaving for the weekend, he walked past Daniel's now empty workstation. The tape holding Olivia's 2 drawings still clung to the side of the monitor even though everything else had been cleared away. Marcus reached toward the faded picture of the blue pickup, paused, and lowered his hand without touching it. Across town, Daniel closed the leather notebook after adding one final entry beneath the shipment number circled days earlier, then placed the notebook beside his phone as a new voicemail notification appeared from an unfamiliar office extension he had never seen before, carrying no message, only a request that he return the call when possible. The path behind him had disappeared completely. SUA Monday morning began with rain tapping steadily against the windshield as Daniel parked outside the children's orthopedic clinic instead of another office building. Olivia adjusted the straps of her purple backpack, tucked a loose strand of hair behind one ear, and reached for the hospital folder resting between them. Daniel handed it over without a word, then waited until she disappeared through the automatic doors before opening the voicemail that had arrived 2 nights earlier. A calm voice identified itself only as an administrative office and requested that he appear downtown before noon to review several employment documents requiring his signature. No company name was mentioned. Daniel closed the message, slipped the phone into his pocket, and drove toward the city with the leather notebook resting on the passenger seat beside him. The conference room waiting for him looked almost identical to the one where he had lost his job. Victor Lang sat at one end of the table with another human resources representative. A legal assistant organized several folders into perfect stacks while Monica entered last, carrying herself with the same composed confidence that had defined every meeting before. The termination package had been revised. Additional language now accused Daniel of deliberately withholding operational information, disrupting executive reporting, and failing to cooperate during an internal review. In exchange for signing the updated agreement, the company would provide 3 months of salary continuation and extend his medical insurance through Olivia's upcoming treatment. Victor slid the pen across the table without meeting Daniel's eyes. The room remained completely still. Daniel read every page from beginning to end, pausing occasionally to compare dates against entries already written inside the leather notebook. His fingers rested briefly on the worn cover before he looked back toward Monica. "The insurance remains active if I sign today?" he asked. Victor answered immediately. "Yes." Daniel looked down again, not at the signature line, but at one paragraph stating that all previous concerns regarding compliance reporting had been investigated and found to be entirely without merit. He removed the pen cap, held it over the paper for several long seconds, then quietly set the pen back on the table untouched. "I cannot sign something I know is inaccurate," he said. Nobody raised a voice. Monica folded the agreement closed and nodded once toward Victor. "Then the offer is withdrawn." Daniel accepted the decision exactly as he had accepted every other consequence since raising his first objection. He placed the unsigned packet back into its folder, gathered the leather notebook, adjusted the cuff of his shirt almost absent-mindedly, and stood. As he reached the door, Victor spoke without lifting his head. "You understand what this means?" Daniel rested one hand on the doorknob. "Yes." He walked away carrying nothing except the notebook and the worn messenger bag that had accompanied him from the first day. Outside, he stopped beneath the building awning while rain collected along the curb. His phone rang. Olivia asked whether he could stop by the grocery store because she had found a cheaper brand of soup the two of them both liked. Daniel smiled softly, wrote the name of the soup beside his shopping list inside the notebook, and promised he would be home before dinner. Across the street, Marcus, the information technology specialist, happened to leave a neighboring office carrying the folded server audit still tucked inside his jacket. He recognized Daniel from the nearly empty workstation that had remained untouched for days. Their eyes met only briefly before Daniel continued toward the parking garage. Marcus watched him disappear into the rain, then looked back at the audit summary in his hand where blank authorization fields interrupted the deletion records exactly where executive approvals should have appeared. He folded the paper again without calling out. Back inside the company, Monica instructed department managers to archive the compliance review permanently and circulate a memorandum describing Daniel Brooks as a former employee dismissed for performance deficiencies. The memo reached inboxes across the organization before sunset. Several employees read it silently. Grace closed the message without deleting it. The warehouse dispatcher placed another duplicate shipping log into his locked drawer. Marcus opened the server audit one more time after everyone else had gone home, comparing the missing authorization trail against the dates Daniel had questioned weeks earlier. He still did not know the whole story, but for the first time he understood that whatever had been hidden could no longer remain buried forever. Meanwhile, Daniel unlocked the front door of his small house carrying groceries in one hand and Olivia's favorite soup in the other, unaware that by refusing to exchange the truth for security he had crossed the final line separating the life he had lost from the one that neither he nor anyone inside the company could ever turn back from, even though every visible door now appeared completely closed. As the following Wednesday, every member of the executive committee received the same unexpected calendar invitation marked mandatory governance session. Monica assumed it concerned quarterly distribution targets. Derek arrived carrying performance summaries. Victor brought personnel files, including Daniel's termination records, neatly organized inside a black binder. None of them noticed that the meeting room contained 2 additional chairs at the far end of the table occupied by outside legal counsel and independent auditors. Marcus entered quietly carrying a sealed evidence envelope. Grace followed several minutes later after receiving direct instructions from corporate compliance to attend as a witness. Conversation faded the moment the chair of the board walked into the room and announced that the session concerned the integrity of the company's operational reporting process. Monica immediately began explaining that the recent personnel issue involving a former compliance specialist had already been resolved internally. Before she finished, the chair opened a folder and placed Daniel's handwritten notebook in the center of the table. Every page had been scanned, dated, and matched against archived paper records recovered from secure storage. Beside it came printed server audit logs identifying the exact timestamps when compliance files disappeared from the database. Marcus quietly confirmed that the deletion requests lacked completed executive authorization and had bypassed required governance procedures. Grace then identified the archived supplier certifications she had recovered from storage, explaining where she found them and when she delivered them to Daniel. The room remained silent as independent auditors projected side-by-side comparisons onto the screen. Shipment quantities changed after approval. Inventory arrival dates no longer matched supplier confirmations. Digital files differed from archived paper copies. Every discrepancy pointed to the same chain of management. Monica attempted to question the reliability of the printed records until the lead auditor displayed Daniel's notebook beside the original documents. Every handwritten entry matched dates, shipment numbers, and document revisions recorded weeks before any investigation had begun. The circled shipment number Daniel had marked on his second week appeared again and again as the starting point from which the entire reporting manipulation could be traced. The chair looked toward Victor. When Mr. Brooks refused to certify the report, why was an independent review not initiated? Victor lowered his eyes to the termination file and found no answer waiting there. Derek shifted forward and insisted Daniel had disrupted operations without presenting evidence. Marcus quietly slid another document across the table. It contained the server audit proving that the electronic records disappeared only after Daniel challenged the report. Nobody reached for it immediately. The chair pressed a single button on the conference phone. "Please ask Mr. Brooks to join us." The door opened less than a minute later. Daniel entered wearing the same faded blue shirt, carrying the same worn messenger bag and the same leather notebook that had quietly documented every decision leading to this room. He greeted everyone with a calm nod before taking the only empty chair. No triumph crossed his face. No anger appeared in his voice. The chair addressed him first. "Mr. Brooks, before your termination became effective, the board unanimously appointed you Independent Ethics Transition Director with authority to trigger an external governance review if internal reporting integrity was compromised. Your appointment was intentionally withheld from operational leadership to protect the investigation from interference. Did you activate that authority after your dismissal?" Daniel answered with the same steady voice that had carried through every difficult meeting. "Yes." The room seemed to shrink around a single word. The phone call outside the building, the refusal to sign inaccurate reports, the careful notebook entries, the unanswered questions, the quiet acceptance of every consequence suddenly aligned into one uninterrupted sequence. He had never been protecting himself. He had been protecting the evidence until the proper process could begin. Monica slowly leaned back in her chair, looking for flaws that no longer existed. Derek stared at the projected records without speaking. Victor closed the termination binder because there was nothing inside it left to defend. The chair turned toward legal counsel. Formal termination notices were authorized immediately for Monica Hale, Derek Lawson, and every manager directly involved in altering compliance records or suppressing internal reporting. Regulatory agencies would receive complete audit packages before the close of business. Daniel remained seated until every decision had been recorded. Only then did he quietly collect the leather notebook, straighten the cuff of his shirt, and stand. As he reached the doorway, employees gathering outside the glass walls stepped aside without being asked, not because of a title they had only just learned, but because every silent choice he had made long before anyone believed him had restored something far more valuable than his own reputation, their faith that integrity could still survive inside the company. SUA 6 weeks later, the operations floor sounded different. Conversations no longer stopped when managers approached, and shipment reports remained open on shared screens instead of disappearing behind hurried clicks. Glass office doors stayed open throughout the day, while bulletin boards that once displayed only performance charts now included compliance procedures, anonymous reporting instructions, and handwritten notes thanking warehouse teams for catching small mistakes before they became larger ones. Daniel arrived before sunrise as he always had, parking beneath the same fading light pole and carrying the same worn messenger bag through the employee entrance. The chipped mountain mug still rested in one hand, and the familiar leather notebook remained tucked beneath his arm, although many of its pages were now blank. During his first walk across the building, he greeted the forklift drivers, warehouse clerks, reception staff, and cleaning crew by name exactly as he had before. The only difference was that people no longer lowered their voices when he passed. They stopped him with questions, suggestions, and concerns they had once kept to themselves. Daniel listened more than he spoke, wrote short notes beside each issue, and thanked every employee before moving on. Grace had accepted responsibility for leading the rebuilt compliance team. She no longer carried folders pressed tightly against her chest. Instead, she walked confidently into meetings with duplicate records openly organized inside clear binders because nobody questioned why documentation should exist in more than one place. Marcus worked beside information technology engineers installing permanent audit tracking that recorded every document revision automatically, leaving no empty authorization fields for anyone to hide behind again. Victor resigned before disciplinary proceedings concluded, leaving behind nothing more than an office stripped of framed certificates and polished speeches about procedure. Monica and Derek departed through the same front entrance where Daniel had once carried his cardboard box alone. There were no raised voices, no audience waiting to celebrate, only security staff collecting identification badges while ordinary employees quietly returned to their workstations. The company continued moving because institutions built on honesty rarely depended on one person's authority alone. On Tuesday afternoon, Daniel left the office early for a reason everyone already knew. Nobody questioned the schedule adjustment. Olivia waited outside the orthopedic clinic wearing the same purple backpack decorated with silver stars, except this time she stood a little straighter than before. She climbed into the pickup truck, placed a follow-up therapy schedule across the center console, and smiled when Daniel reached automatically toward the grocery list tucked inside the leather notebook. "You remembered the soup again," she said. Daniel glanced toward the passenger seat where two cans rested beside her backpack and nodded. "Some things are worth remembering every time." They drove home with the windows open as late afternoon sunlight replaced weeks of steady rain. That evening, Olivia carried the empty dinner bowls into the sink before Daniel could stand. She rolled her eyes when he reached for the dish towel anyway and handed it to him with exaggerated seriousness. He accepted it without argument. After the kitchen was clean, they stepped onto the small back porch where the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass drifting across neighboring yards. Olivia leaned against the porch railing while Daniel opened the leather notebook one final time. He looked at the pages filled with shipment numbers, dates, signatures, and careful observations that had carried both of them through the hardest weeks of their lives. Then he closed the cover gently and placed the notebook on the porch table instead of returning it to his pocket. The next morning, father and daughter walked side by side through the company lobby on the way to a community health partnership event supporting local children's hospitals. Employees looked up from reception desks and loading schedules, offering quiet greetings that carried neither fear nor obligation. Daniel answered each one with the same calm nod he had always given, then reached down as Olivia slipped her hand into his. Together they crossed the lobby toward the sunlight beyond the glass doors, leaving behind a building that had finally learned to recognize character before status, while the small silver stars on her purple backpack caught the morning light with every step, and neither of them looked back.